You know, I'm actually a little nervous. I haven't done this in a while. And I look like crap, and I know it. It's been a long few weeks. I have a lot going on, not just with the job, but with the moving situation and the personal situation, all that fun stuff. And to be completely honest with you, I've had these new headphones for about 2 weeks now. One of my friends, Gary, very kindly and generously donated them to me. And I've had a few periods of time where I've had time to sit down and do this, but I just haven't had the energy, I haven't had the focus, I haven't had the concentration. In fact, I'm not even 100% sure I'm going to manage it tonight, but I'm going to try. And my notes today. Yeah. But I just wanted to apologize because things have been rough and I look like crap, and I probably sound like crap too. I'm not 100% sure how the sound quality of this new headset is going to be once I get this onto YouTube, so we'll see, I suppose. Next thing I want to talk about. Obviously, since I'm not doing Final Fantasy 1 here, we did in fact finish Skyward Sword, and since I'm reviewing it, I do think it is a good game. I have gone on record before as saying that there is no such thing as a bad Zelda game. You know, the worst Zelda I've ever played was good. At the worst, if you know what I'm saying. You know, every other Zelda has been great or fantastic or amazing or better. And I've stood by that statement for quite a while. That's why I was willing to go so far out on a limb with Skyward Sword, because you require the Wii Motion Plus for it, right? And I didn't have that, so I had to. Now, granted, I got the pre-order thing, so I got the new Wiimote, the golden one, which was awesome. But the point is, I still had to spend more money just to be able to play the game, and I was buying this accessory for this game for no other reason. The only reason I was willing to go forward on that is because it was a Zelda. Now, I still stand by that statement. This was still worth it. I don't regret it. But if someone else were to come to me and ask, I would tell them to at least think about the decision. That one problem, the fact that you need the Wii Motion Plus, is, in my opinion, the second greatest obstacle to this game being properly enjoyed. Because you know, what else are you going to use it for, essentially? If you have other games that use the Wii Motion Plus, great. The only one I can think of that I played and enjoyed to any extent is actually Red Steel 2. Not a bad game, but we're still at the point where we have two games for an accessory, which isn't really worth it, to be honest with you. Not that I regret the purchase, but I would caution anyone in the future who was choosing to do so. Now, I basically just gave away the summary right there. Let's go ahead and move through. I have this kind of flow I want to keep here. Let's talk about the graphics of this game. I had no problem with Wind Waker's graphics personally. I thought the cartoony style was, at the very least, acceptable given the way the game worked and how expressive it allowed them to be. And of course, it made this very strange contrast because Wind Waker was actually a fairly serious story, all things considered. Not the most serious of the Zelda series, but it was also one of the very first Zeldas that was very concretely a sequel. Arguably the first Zelda that was concretely a sequel, and actually directly came from the previous game, Ocarina of Time. And it really fleshed out the setting, it really fleshed out the characters. We actually saw Ganondorf, the same Ganondorf, you know, stuff like that. And so having that with the cartoon thing was a very Dragon Quest sort of thing, a very Earthbound sort of thing. You know, it looks like it's silly, it looks like it's lighthearted and rompy, and it kind of is at times, but it really isn't for the most part, and that worked. Twilight Princess was a very serious story, and my favorite of the stories, actually, basically my favorite of the Zeldas, or rather it's tied for my favorite of the Zeldas, but a very first serious story, very serious tone, very serious themes, again, a direct sequel, and clearly so, and it had a much more, I hate to call it realistic, but I don't know what else to call it, so whatever, a much more realistic design to the graphics and to the textures and all that fun stuff. And that worked for that game. Skyward Sword, if you haven't seen it yet, which I'm sure you have, but seeing it in action really gets the point across. It is a pure mesh of these two styles. It really is. It is the two styles met basically at the halfway point, because it's very clearly the cell shading and it's very clearly the cartoony look, and the faces are much more cartoonish and expressive and exaggerated. But the modeling and the polygonal, there are sufficient polygons in the models and in some of the textures that get the point across that this is leaning more towards realistic rather than, you know, Wind Waker, which was a sphere, and you get my point here. This amalgamation between the two results in a very strange experience, if I'm honest. Personally, I think they should have done one or the other. The cartoony look with a serious story, and make no mistake, Skyward Sword does have a serious story to it. The cartoony look over here would have worked for the same reason it works in Dragon Quest, for the same reason it worked in Earthbound, for the same reason it worked in Wind Waker. I personally would have preferred if they'd done the Twilight Princess thing, if they'd actually gone with a slightly more realistic, more serious look to it, and actually, did that. Maybe not go overboard on the shading. I'll admit that, but the point remains, actually, that graphical style would have suited this story much better. It would have been much more of an accent. It would have been complementary to the plot and the setting and everything, really. What you have is a world that is effectively a post-apocalypse, for all intents and purposes, and you are rediscovering it and starting over. You are beginning the post-apocalypse, and I think that, that would suit the more serious graphic style better. Now, let me take a moment and say that I'm not actually complaining about the graphics. I think they were fine. I think they were sufficiently expressive. I just think it would have been better if they did this thing. Now, since I just talked about the graphics, let's go ahead and segue about what I was mentioning there, the story. The story of Skyward Sword is probably its strongest point. Actually, there's no probably. It is its strongest point. The story is what kept me playing, despite other things I'll talk about later, and what kept the little one and the friends who would occasionally hop in and watch play Zelda with us interested. It was the thing that we kept wanting to see more about. The story is truly and genuinely the origin story of the Zelda series, and it's clearly designed to be like that. It is clearly meant to be the tale of all tales. Every Zelda has some degree of long ago this happened. Even Zelda 2 had that. Actually, Zelda 1 had that too, for that matter, in brevity, obviously. But every Zelda has had some concept of this is what happened before. But this one is essentially that story, what happened before. The kind of thing they tried to do with Ocarina to some extent, but much more so. This is the beginning of the entirety of everything. And I think it pulls that off rather well, personally. I do think it was a good choice to make as far as where to go. I think that finally releasing the official canon of all the Zeldas and showing how they all stuck together, how they were all contiguous with each other, was a good move. And it was a perfect time to do it, since Skyward Sword explains the origin of all that and blah 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 blah. For the record, I was pretty close to right with my theories about the timelines, but I will freely admit that I was also wrong in several points. I don't think anybody I knew who was theorizing about that knew there was a third timeline, for example, but let's just move on. But Skyward Sword itself does have a rather serious theme to it. I'll talk about one of my complaints about the story, indeed my only complaint about the story, in a moment, but the theme of the story is very much the persistence of vision, basically. And yes, I know that's a phrase and has nothing to do with this, but the desire and design of individuals to do more than they are capable of doing. Now, that sounds like a very generic theme, and that's probably because it is, but from the very beginning, every major NPC, I shouldn't say every major character within the story, tries to do more than they are capable of, and slowly works their way up to the point where they're actually capable of accomplishing what it is they want to do. Even Groose, of all people, actually managed that throughout the story. Hell, even the villain did to an extent. And the concept there, the feeling, the theme of becoming or perhaps proving true that you are greater than the sum of your parts. That concept, that feeling of more, was something that was very pervasive throughout the entirety of the story, all the way down to the little mini quests, when you're talking to the dragons and all that. And as far as the overall arcing plot, there was a very strong theme of we are greater than the sum of our parts. Like I said, nowhere is this more strongly said than in Fee. Fee, the sword, for anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, is effectively a robot, or a golem if you prefer, but the difference between the two in a fantasy setting is null. She, or it, I guess would be a little more accurate, very much behaves as though she should, and yet in several points throughout the story, most especially towards the end, she does strive to be more than just a sword, to be more than just a robot, to be more than just this. And this is most strongly emphasized by her counterpoint, the villain, Giranim, who, spoiler alert, is also a sword, but he spends so much of the game basically rebelling against that concept, rebelling against the fact that he is just a sword. While he was certainly willing and capable and free to be a tool of Demise, he nevertheless wanted to be more, and he showed this through his actions, through his presentation, through his showmanship. The whole time through the game, he's being this flashy, and I'm a guy thing, and doing the teleport, and I'm so much better than this, showing that he wanted to be more, to be seen as something greater than just what he was, if you follow what I'm saying. And I could go into several details of instances of this happening. Of course, the mini game with the demon guy, Betru or whatever. I actually can't think of his name. You know who I'm talking about. The gratitude crystal guy is another good example of this. But I could go on and on and on. But there are dozens upon dozens of examples of this theme, of this concept. And that's basically what the whole of the story is about. There is only one other major thread going throughout all of it, and that's basically beginnings, which is basically. In a summary, this story started at basically the perfect part to explain the beginning of Zelda, because everything that happened before this, while relevant, doesn't need to be shown. The world's made, the Triforce is made, the personification of hate basically comes into being. That would be Demise, by the way. The war is fought between the two sides. The one side is defeated and sealed. The land is taken up into the sky. All of this is certainly relevant, but none of this is actually pertinent enough to Zelda as a whole to be shown, if you follow what I'm saying here. All of this could be summarized, and indeed is. This point, right here, right after that, or relatively speaking, we don't know how many years it's been, but relatively speaking, nothing happens between the end of that war and Skyloft being lifted up into the sky and then the story starting of relevance. This part right here is the perfect part to start the story at. This is when everything begins, and everything that is relevant to Zelda. The human who strives to be more than what he is, the boy in green, who works and strives and basically becomes an embodiment of courage without ever actually interacting with the Triforce. The young girl who is wise beyond her years and knows what she needs to do and basically acts as not so much the proponent of what is happening, but the catalyst for it. And, of course, the great evil that is basically just trying to wreck things up, all the concepts were there, and all of them began there, and it shows how that happened. It shows how it grew. In every other Zelda, Link, in almost every other Zelda, Link is someone who is filling someone else's shoes. One of the things I really liked about Skyward Sword is there are no one's shoes to fill. No one has ever done what you're doing before. No one has ever stood up to him. Demise actually says this specifically when you face him. When last I walked on this earth, humans cowered and fled before me. I can't believe one of you has finally had the courage to stand up and face me. I liked that. It really got the point across that Link really was the beginning of it all, if you follow what I'm saying here. Now, let me completely contrast all that wonderfulness by saying how much I hated Link in this game. Everything I just said about him, rising up and being the first and blah, 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 beautiful. But all of that was things that Link was doing, not Link himself. The single greatest flaw of Skyward Sword's SS's I don't know why I'm having trouble with that tonight. Story, in my opinion, is Link. In every Zelda from Link to the Past to now, Link has had a degree of personality. It has not always been expressive, it has not always been fantastic, it has not always been the most in-depth Shakespearean thing in the world. But there's always something there, there's always a feeling there, there's always a clear-cut character, if you follow what I'm saying here. He has never been, with a few exceptions, going back to the older Zeldas, you can say this, but with a few exceptions, Link has never been an avatar for the player. When you're playing World of Warcraft, just to diverge for just a second, unless you're a total freaking geek like me, your character has no real personality, is what I'm saying here. Obviously, there are ways you can get around that, but my point is, let me try and say this properly. I'm sorry. The character you are playing isn't actually a character, it is a personification of you. It is an avatar. That is actually what an avatar means. But I'm trying to get this point across to emphasize the difference. When you play Final Fantasy, you are playing as a character or characters. They have their own personality, their own distinct views that are segregate of you and any choices you make. When you play, let's use actually a much more direct example. When you play Fallout, or when you play an Elder Scrolls, you are, for all intents and purposes, the personality of this character. You make their choices. You make their decisions. You choose how their dialogue goes. You get what I'm saying here? And so, in Skyward Sword, rather than Link being over here a defined character with his own traits, with his own personality, he's a blank slate. This is my biggest complaint about Skyward Sword story. The Link you're playing feels like an avatar, a piece of cardboard. But when you have that, imagine if you were playing the Elder Scrolls or Fallout or World of Warcraft or whatever. But the Elder Scrolls and Fallout really emphasize this more than anything else. And you had no dialogue options. Imagine doing that for a moment. Imagine if you walked up to someone and they start talking to you and they have a personality and they have a voice actor and they do all this fun stuff and you never respond. You never say anything. You never do anything. Or rather, there's no interaction in this cutscene. They just talk to you, and then the cutscene ends, and then you move on. Now, I don't know about you, but that would bug the crap out of me. And indeed it did in Skyward Sword, because that's exactly how it worked. Link was just a piece of cardboard. The only thing he had approaching real motivation was the fact that he was trying to save Zelda. The whole game, actually. Right up until the end, he was trying to save Zelda. Which is funny, actually, if you think about it. Very few of the Zelda games have had Rescue Zelda as a plot point from point one. Very few of them have. Usually there's something else you're after for some other motive, some other gain. Twilight Princess is an excellent example of that. You're not trying to rescue Zelda till way further into the game on that one. But you get my point. Other than that one motivation, he shows no reaction. He doesn't have much expression. He's just kind of there. He's just an avatar. He is a Link. I know that's why the character was named that. I get it. I know the stories. But I had gotten accustomed to and indeed enjoyed the fact that Link was actually a character. In Wind Waker and Twilight Princess and Ocarina of Time and Link to the Past, Link still had a degree of personality. It was minuscule, I'll admit, but it was there. So, I'm going to shut up about this. I'm sorry. I wanted to talk about this at length because this is something that I've been thinking about, ever since I've been playing the game. But that's my only complaint about the story. Other than that, I say it's top notch. The ending actually did move me to tears. I admit that freely. You can ask the people who are watching it with me. I was just, wow. Excellent game, magnificent, powerful, very well written. So definite plus there. I do want to talk about the newness, as I mentioned in my notes here. One of the things that was stated by the developers when they went into Skyward Sword is they wanted to make it not be a formulaic Zelda. Ever since Link to the Past, all of the Zeldas have followed the same pattern. You get the first few... You have the tutorial dungeon, which sets the stage. You have a couple items where you have to get something that's important. You have another in-between dungeon, and usually a boss, and then something is revealed, plot-wise. And then you have several dungeons, which you have to go through for another reason. And there's a whole bunch of mini-games on the side, and blah, blah, blah. And then you get to a big old dungeon, and then there's usually something after that, which is the big final boss, right? Sound familiar? Now, I'm one of those really strange people who thinks repetition is not a bad thing if it's done properly. I've said this many times before. It doesn't matter if it's new, if it's innovative. What matters is if it's good. Now, Skyward Sword, they explicitly went out to say, we're going to try and be a little different. We're going to go off the beaten path. Now, obviously, there were some very clear Zelda tendencies within Skyward Sword, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in my opinion, they tried too hard, if that makes any sense. They made too much of an endeavor to try to make things different. It was little things as you play through. It's almost hard to describe. The boss fights are a little bit different. The dungeons are kind of roaming and sometimes feel a little aimless, if you know what I mean. Because they're not actually supposed to be dungeons. They're just trying to make it another sequence and blah, 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 blah. Not that I'm complaining. I just want to stress this. This is actually not a complaint. I just think it felt like they were trying too hard, and honestly, I wish they had just gone ahead and made the game as they wanted to, if you know what I mean here, if they had just done it. But that's just me, of course. I do think they did pull it off fairly well. The only parts that were truly irritating, as far as the newness, as far as the desire to do things differently, was the fact that the bosses were just irritating. Allow me to explain why. If you have a boss, and you have to do this to hit him, okay? This is really simple, but you get the point. You have to do this exact maneuver, which I've already forgotten what the heck I did. That, in order to hit them. Okay. By standard designer logic, basically, and this applies to all video games, the more times you do this, the worse you get after a certain point. There's actually a bit of a formula. It kind of goes like this, as far as desirability. If you do it once, it's still down here. It's like, yeah, okay, I managed it well. If you do it twice, okay, that's a little better. Usually 3 times is the golden rule. There's a reason why the rule of 3 exists in entertainment industry, and it's true for video games, movies, TV shows, music. The rule of 3 exists for a good reason. 3 is almost always the perfect number for repetition and for pauses. You hit the boss in his weak point 3 times. He usually gets stronger each time. Makes sense, right? A lot of video games do that, and there's a reason for that. If you do it too few times, it just feels too easy. If you do it too many, it just feels boring. You're no longer fighting a boss that is difficult or engaging. What you are doing is repetition without purpose, if you know what I mean. This is an example of repetition being done poorly. So if I have to do this 3 times in any other Zelda, this is Skyward Sword. Oh, I screwed that one up, so hang on. I probably screwed that one up too. Hang on. And you get my point here? It just kind of goes on and on and on. The bosses have way too much health, and they're still Zelda bosses, so you still have to, you still have to do this. You still have to do this specific motion, or this specific thing, or you have to hit them with this specific thing. But with a few exceptions, and there were some exceptions, several of the bosses just had too much health, and it just got repetitious. But other than that one thing, I do think the newness was a good thing. I do think, I just want to take a moment here to gush about several of the good things about this game. I talked about the story, of course. Several of the concepts, for lack of a better term, were awesome. The time puzzle thing, which I am now using in my D&D game because it's such an amazing concept I can't possibly not, was a thing of genius. And the first time I saw it, I was just like, oh my god, that was awesome. And the ship was such a logical and beautiful extension of that. Sailing on waves of ocean that only exist in the past, but it's okay because you're moving and the time stone's moving with you, so the waves are moving with you. Oh my god, beautiful. Yes, you can argue the physics. Let's leave physics out there. We're moving in a bubble of time. Give me a break. I thought it was awesome. I thought that was the highlight of the entire game, was that whole sequence. And you actually go there twice, so heck yeah. That was awesome. I do like several of the gimmicks, the tools they give you this time. Of course, you don't have the boomerang, but you still have the bow and arrow. Of course, I've gone on record and saying I like the Twilight Princess gimmick items best. Ball and chain, and of course the top. But there were several fun ones in this one. The beetle was actually really amusing. It got to the point where anytime we would enter a new area, she would be like, "Okay, go ahead and scout the area, and I'd just pull the beetle out and just look around and get a nice bird's eye view of what's going on and what we have to do and all that fun stuff. Excellent design. And of course the whip. I didn't get a lot of use out of the whip, I'll be completely honest with you. But strangely enough, I got tons of use out of the air blower thing, the nuclear hair dryer, I guess is what we'll call that thing. That was very amusing, and I liked that a lot. And so forth and so on. And there was actually a lot of I'll use the word innovation here. There was a lot of creative ideas. There were a lot of really inventive things that they did. Now, that's not part of the newness. That's why I had to segregate this. Zelda generally always does that kind of thing. They're always creative. They're always inventive. Phantom Hourglass is actually my favorite example of that. That game is the only DS game I know that actually uses all the features of the DS and does so to such a beautiful and creative degree that it blows my mind. Oh my god. Amazing thing. Let's go ahead and move on from here. Minigames. I wanted to talk about the minigames in brief because they irritated the heck out of me. There were several minigames in Skyward Sword. I guess I'm lying. They didn't irritate me that badly, but you would the bug catching one was one that I was ramming my head into a wall over for quite a while, and admittedly there's another reason for that. I'm still leaving that for last, but I just thought I'd mention it. The whole I actually can't remember the other mini. I'm sorry, I really am losing some concentration here. In general, the mini games were about average for a Zelda. Nothing bad about them. But I guess the fact that I can't remember them that specifically really gets the point across. You know, I could still remember the double hook shot one in Twilight Princess. I still remember the bow through the targets thing in Link to the Past, and I still remember fishing in Link's Awakening. You know, I could go on. None of the minigames really wowed me in Skyward Sword, which is almost a shame because there was a lot of potential for that. The only one I remember distinctly, which I was saving up for here, was the chop the bamboo one down. But unfortunately, due to the nature of the game and the problem I'll mention later, it's almost impossible to actually do it properly. You kind of have to get lucky, basically, or just get spastic, one of the two. So, some wasted potential there, but at least it wasn't amusing. Speaking of minigames, since they're basically all Skyward, the whole flying around Skyloft thing, I guess it would actually be like this, is yet another example of the Zelda overworld concept. It's something they've done before, obviously. The very first time they really tried that was Ocarina. You know, you go out into the fields, and it's like, my goodness, this place is huge for the time. I look back at that and I think, wow, it's tiny. But you get the point, you know, they gave you the horse, you could get across that, and then Wind Waker had the boat, you know, blah, blah, blah. Of these, I personally think that Spirit Tracks is my favorite of the overworld concepts. Skyward Sword's air thing, how do I put this? The world, the overworld, the sky just felt a little bit too empty. There were tons of little islands around there, and at first I was really excited. And in fact, one of the very first things we did way back in like last November or December, or whenever we were picking up this game and started doing Zelda Night, was I picked up the thing and we started flying around and checking out the rocks. And about 20 rocks later, I realized they were just rocks. Sometimes they had a warp thing in them, sometimes they would eventually have a chest in them, sometimes they had an enemy on them, but that was it. There was nothing there to explore, there was nothing to do, if you know what I mean. It was empty space. And there was a lot of it. There was actually a fairly large amount of it. And it got to the point where getting around just kind of became a chore rather than an enjoyment. You know, just to use an example from tonight. Tonight, I was playing Twilight Princess with everyone because Zelda Night has become such a regular thing, and we're just going to move through them now, so we're playing Twilight Princess next. We had just gotten Epona and gotten out to the overworld, if you want to call it that, you know, the major Hyrule Fields area, and I knew where to go, of course, because I've played the game before, but they don't, and so they were like, well, go over here, go over here, go over there, you know, and started directing me around, and there was a degree of fun in exploring and just checking out what was over this ridge, going through the lake, you know, going up to the gateway, you know, looking at the twilight sky on the horizon as we're driving by. You know, there were things to look at. It felt more like we were exploring. This just happened to me tonight, so, you know, I can use this example rather directly. In Skyward Sword, there's nothing up there. The only thing, there's three things. There's the main island, there's the Pumpkin Island, which I saw basically immediately, and there's the Stormfront, which I can't remember. It actually has a name. It's like the Storm Vaunt or something like that. And those three things caught my eye basically immediately. And after some exploring, I found out that in addition to that, there's basically three other islands. That's it. It was empty, and it was unfortunate because they could have done so much with that, you know. Phantom, not to go back to Phantom Hourglass, but every spot in Phantom Hourglass had a point to it. Granted, there was a bit of distance between it, possibly a little bit too much distance, but if you went to an island, there was something there. It might be something minor, it might be something for later, it might be just rupees, it might just be a little fun thing, but there was something there. It wasn't just a rock that you bump into, if you follow what I'm saying. A bit of a disappointment on that one. The controls, ironically, for the whole sky thing were actually really awesome, I thought. You know, this whole thing actually is a little bit more innovative, or not innovative, shoot, what's the word I'm thinking of? Intuitive than it sounds. It's basically this. You fly like doing this, right? Although if you're doing it like this, you're doing it wrong because this is going to wear out your wrist. Take some advice from me. Do it like this. Do this thing right here. This is how I was flying around. And then you go up, then you go up, and then back down, and up and back down. This was actually pretty fun, I admit, and I do genuinely wish there had been more there. Maybe it was a deadline issue, maybe they just didn't feel like it. I don't know. But this all brings me to the final point. I'm going to think about this for a moment. Is there anything else I want to talk about before I hit the final point? Actually, there's one thing I want to discuss really briefly. Geek mode here, okay? I freely admit, this is your warning. The mythos of Zelda has always been a little bit morphic, and there's always been a degree of relativity to the way you can define whether one thing or another is deific or powerful or ancient spirit or the fairy queen, all this fun stuff, right? The mythos has all been kind of fluid. Skyward Sword really put a bit of a hard lock on it by actually defining probably the first thing that would qualify as in D&D terms, as a member of a pantheon, as an actual deity rather than a demi-deity, and that would be Demise. Demise and his influence, he was very specifically designed. They did this on purpose, and you can tell by looking at him. Yes, the obvious references to Ganondorf are there. I unfortunately do not remember the other names I wanted to mention here. I apologize. But there are several other villains other than Ganondorf who obviously it's actually reversed. Demise drew inspiration from them because they made the Skyward Sword later. But in lore terms and character terms, his influence is felt on them. Their existence, their presence is clearly felt and reflected based on Demise himself. And his whole, my cycle will continue thing wasn't just talking about Ganondorf. It was talking about that general concept of courage, wisdom, and, well, actually hatred in this case, and his desire to be outside of that. It is this slot over here that is the one that keeps rotating, because these two are fairly constant, but the third slot, the third part of the Triforce here, see if I can still do it. Oh, that's hard to do still. I actually had this really well at one point, little Triforce thing there. Anyway, sorry, geek. But, what they did with Skyward Sword was they laid down a concrete layer of, this is the beginning of all evil. This is the beginning of all the darkness. This is the beginning of all the villains, to some extent or another, throughout the entirety of the Zelda mythos. They all draw back to Demise, because even though he, as a sentient creature, was destroyed, just as Fi was, his essence, his presence, his intent, his hatred, really, endured, and as Fi's did, as the Master Sword, you know what I mean? And, excuse me, and so they really created an interesting sort of bedrock there, which I really thought was very well done, because Demise himself, they actually mentioned this, that what you see there is based on your own perceptions of him. So the assumption there is that we're seeing what Link is seeing, but there's a wonderfully meta thing about that, if you really think about that. What Demise is viewed as depends on the individual. And so we, the players, are actually seeing Demise as someone who looks like an amalgamation of, and with different stylings of, the various Zelda villains throughout history, with some exceptions, obviously. And I thought that was really cool, actually, the way they did that. It may not have been intentional, but it fits rather well if you think about it. And in laying that down, they also explain something else. Because Demise was diffused, was spread out. His essence, his hatred, all that fun stuff, was blanketed out by his destruction, which explains why it is that Ganondorf, in virtually all of his incarnations, is not psychotically evil, if you know what I mean. I used to call it evil in D&D terms, in the alignment table. Someone who is literally just out to blow up, destroy, crush, hate everything, an embodiment of hatred. Zeramus from Final Fantasy IV would be an example of what I'm talking about here. Rather, Ganondorf had aims, he had personality, he actually had, light sides to him in certain of the games. He actually had depth to him. Especially Wind Waker is an excellent example that comes to mind. And so that diffusion helps explain that away. Explains, how do I put this? The fact that even Ganondorf, in most of the games, has been a very dark shade of gray, but nevertheless a shade of gray rather than black, is brought into contrast by putting an actual black at the source of his actions. Demise is something unique in the Zelda mythos, because he is black. And I'm not talking about his skin color, you know what I mean? He is evil, flat, period, the end, no redeemable qualities, no remorse, no nothing. He is the Voldemort of his setting, and he is at the core of all of the problems that stem thereafter. And I thought that was a really interesting choice for them to make. As much as I wanted to scoff at Demise when I first encountered him and when I first started hearing about him, ultimately, I think they did a very good thing with him. I think they used him, stylistically speaking, and from a storytelling perspective, as a tool not just for Skyward Sword, but for the Zelda series, for the Zelda mythos as a whole. I'm done with geek mode, ultra geek mode. I just really wanted to talk about it because I really found that fascinating, and I have so few people to talk with about that. Well, like 5, poor people. Anyways, let's talk about the problem with Skyward Sword. I said before that Skyward Sword is at the very least a good game because it's a Zelda game and it is proven to keep the trend going. Honestly, and I've thought about this a lot, as to which Zelda game I would rate towards the bottom. Skyward Sword would be very close to the bottom. And there is one reason why. The controller. It is a very rare game, that I play at least, that the controls and the mechanics of the game, I'd call it the UI, but it's really not. It is purely 100% the controls were so bad and so frustrating and so irritating and so wearying. And, you know, after certain bosses, as I'm standing there flailing wildly trying to get this thing, getting frustrated, having to calm myself down so I could do the motions properly, putting the controller down and pausing the game so I can rest my wrists, because everything has so much more HP. I mentioned this earlier. So, again, this thing, no. It's more like, okay, this, and then this, and then this, and except it didn't take the stab. There we go. Now it did. And then I think the movement to the Wii Motion control, the Wii Motion Plus control for the sword, was a very bad move. If it was true one-to-one, if it wasn't jittery, if it didn't do things I don't want it to do, if it was quick enough to actually keep up with me. Granted, I have pretty good reflexes in general, but most gamers have pretty good reflexes, and most gamers can do this, you know? If you do this, all it's going to recognize is that you moved. In fact, if you do this movement specifically, I'll tell you exactly what it'll do. It'll slice like this, because right before you did that, there's just a bit of a tension in your hand, and it goes jerks like this. It's actually really hard to see, but trust me, when you do this, it jerks up first, and so it's like, wow! Absolutely, immensely, incredibly frustrating. I could talk about this for hours. I'm not going to. But it never stopped. In every aspect of the game, it was very clearly just something that shouldn't be. I kept wishing that there was some way I could hook up a GameCube controller or something and just play the game rather than hate the game because of the UI, or not because of the controls. And it's not just the Wii Motion Plus, although that is like 80% of it or 85% of it, but the controls themselves were very loose. For any of you who have played Asheron's Call and Asheron's Call 2, this is the important part, you'll know what I mean. Asheron's Call 2 felt like you were moving on ice all the time. You know, it really had this very uncontrolled feel to it, which I didn't actually like that much. It was a shame. I like that game otherwise. But, you know, most games of an MMO site, like Asheron's Call, feel like you're moving properly. I don't even know how to explain this properly. Skyward Sword had that same problem, though. It felt like I was moving on ice all the time. It felt like Link was drunk half the time. I couldn't get him to do exactly what I wanted him to do because I'd tilt like this, and he'd look over there, and then he'd jump. Immensely frustrating, immensely irritating, and drove me nuts. Actually caused me aggravation to the point where I had to put down the game and be like, guys, I'll be right back, because this is stupid. I shouldn't be getting upset about a game, you know? I shouldn't be getting upset about something I'm trying to have fun with. Nowhere is this more strongly felt. I'm only going to give you one specific example. The last boss, okay? Here's how the last boss works, alright? Demise is there. You're here. You both have swords, okay? Let me pause for just a moment and say that the last boss with Ganondorf in Twilight Princess was absolutely amazing. The lead up to it and the final actual encounter with you and him on the ground on swords, poetry. This was the opposite of that, okay? If this were any other game, I would have beaten Demise in 20 seconds. If I was playing like this, I would have crushed him like a bug. He was pathetic and he was easy. I had to redo it several times and was getting so frustrated I kept having to pause. And indeed, again, I had to rest my arm. I had to rest my wrist several times. And my thumb, actually, was the other one. Because what you had to do was you had to put the sword up, and this is phase 2, actually. I'm not going to bore you with phase 1. You had to put the sword up, catch the lightning, dodge the attack that he's inevitably going to do in seconds. Yes, you can do it while he's catching the lightning too. Let's just not get into that. I know how to fight the boss. Please don't comment and say, "Oh, you're just doing it wrong." No, I'm not. The problem was the control wouldn't recognize that I was holding it up 9 times out of 10, and that's not an exaggeration. I was actually doing this just before after I'd done a recent reload. I was trying to find the exact point, and the exact point was actually about like this for me. This was up, and recalibrating it didn't change this fact. If you know what I mean, if you've dealt with the Wii Motion Plus, you know what I'm talking about. Recalibrating it didn't fix it, so I had to find the exact position. And mind you, despite being an easy boss, you still have to do this very quickly. You have about a second to get that sword up there, maybe a little less, and then you have about 7/10, yeah, that's right, of a second to react to what he's about to do next, which can be one of like 5 things. Okay, still fine if I had a controller. This thing was so clunky and so frustrating and so irritating that a boss that I should have destroyed, that I should have mopped the floor with, beat me over and over again because the controller wouldn't work right. And that is bad game design right there. And that is why Skyward Sword, and that reason by itself, is why Skyward Sword is at the bottom of the list of the Zeldas. Maybe not the actual bottom, because it did have a good story. I want to stress this. I plowed through this game, despite this horrible UI, which was causing me frustration and pain every single time I played it. I still put up with it because the story was awesome, and I still enjoyed the game. But, God, let me play it on a real controller, please! I'm begging you. And that is my synopsis of Skyward Sword in a nutshell. If you can put up with this, buy it. Have fun with it. Enjoy it. But in all honesty, unlike most of my Zeldas, I don't think I will be replaying Skyward Sword. And this is 100% of the reason why. All the other irritations and frustrations are so minor and inconsequential that they're not even on the radar. I would definitely replay Skyward Sword, if not for this. I don't feel like putting up with this again. My very first fight with Girinem was also frustrating. That was the first time I learned that I had to stop being good reflexes, basically. I had to stop having good speed. You know, I had to not actually fence. I had to do this. This is the only way I could... Oops, sorry about that. This is the only way I could convince the controller that I was actually making a sword movement. Anything else I tried to do... You know, obviously my initial movements were just way too quick. I'm not even doing it here. But just doing this right here, this medium slow speed here, was too much for the damn controller. I'm gonna stop talking about that now. But I can't overemphasize it. I really can't. It was frustrating. It was irritating, and it ticked me off constantly. It never stopped being a problem, all the way to the end, all the way to the last boss. And that's my thoughts on Skyward Sword in a nutshell. I do still recommend it if you can put up with this. This is the problem right here. Good story, good concept, good setup. A couple of flaws along the way. Still very cool. Still very interesting. One thing I have recommended to a friend, by the way, I hate to say this very last, is pull up one of those walkthrough videos of it on YouTube and just enjoy the game viewing it. I know, speaking as a gamer, I know that's not the same thing, but you will get most of the good and won't have to deal... You'll get about 60% of the good and won't have to deal with this, which is 100% of the bad. So, that's my opinion. And now, I'm going to go and post this.